Hello students, Mrs. Klein's here, and today we're going to get started with your next section of video notes, section 2, over ecological pyramids. Let's go ahead and get started. The first part of our notes begins with the source of energy in ecosystems, or more specifically, where the energy comes from that is used to drive all of the processes in an ecosystem. There are two sources of energy, and what specifically is harnessed depends on the ecosystem itself. Most ecosystems utilize energy from the sun in a process known as photosynthesis. This is why we always begin with the sun in a food chain, because it is the main source of energy for most living things on our planet. Accompanying the sun's energy, autotrophs or producers also need water and carbon dioxide to complete the chemical reaction. The combination of these three reactants results in the formation of oxygen, which plants do not utilize, but is necessary for heterotrophs or consumers like us to live. And the other product is glucose. Glucose is a sugar that plants utilize to complete their remaining chemical processes, and is also what we and other consumers obtain when we eat producers as well as other consumers so we can undergo our body processes. Now, there are parts of the world that do not receive sunlight, like the benthic zone in the ocean. This is the deep, dark depths of the ocean, but they still need to harness an energy source so they can survive. In this case, these autotrophs, or producers, will undergo something known as chemosynthesis. If you break the words of photosynthesis down, you realize that photo means light and synthesis means to make. Therefore, photosynthesis means you are using sunlight to make usable energy. So let's look at that related to chemosynthesis. The chemo portion refers to using chemicals, and once again, synthesis means to make. So you are using chemicals to make a usable form of energy. Chemosynthesis uses inorganic molecules like hydrogen sulfide, methane, and hydrogen gas, along with carbon dioxide and water to make sugar that those particular organisms can utilize to complete their own cellular processes. And other organisms can harness that energy by consuming the organisms that undergo chemosynthesis. You might be asking yourself what type of organisms undergo chemosynthesis, and if you guessed autotrophs, you are correct. However, these organisms live in such extreme environments like very high temperatures, very high salt conditions, or very low or very high pH values that they are actually called autotrophic extremophiles. A great example of an autotrophic extremophile is the bacteria that reside inside these giant tube worms. The giant tube worms can be found near deep sea vents, or what we might call hydrothermal vents. The tube worms lack a digestive system and is an awesome example of mutualism. It works like this. The bacteria that reside inside the tube worms harness the inorganic molecules and transform them into organic molecules via chemosynthesis. The tube worms are then able to consume the organic molecules to survive. Now that we know where the energy comes from, let's talk about how the energy progresses through the feeding levels in an ecosystem. The feeding levels in an ecosystem are actually called trophic levels. Trophic levels can be a bit tricky because you inherently want to call the first trophic level the primary consumer, but please do not do that. The first trophic level, which you can see by the chart on your screen, is always the producer because it is essentially the first feeding level. The second feeding level or trophic level is your primary consumer or your herbivore. The third feeding level or trophic level is your secondary consumer, which is usually a carnivore or an omnivore. Your fourth feeding level or trophic level is your tertiary consumer, which is almost always a carnivore. Now it is important to note that sometimes if you have a quaternary consumer, you may also have a fifth trophic level or feeding level. This is perfectly fine, but does not always happen. If you look at the pyramid on your screen, you will notice that the trophic levels have been labeled. You will also notice that the hawk, a quaternary consumer, is at the fifth trophic level, and the grasshopper, the primary consumer, is at the second trophic level. Therefore, it is important to remember that trophic levels are all about feeding levels and not about identifying the levels of consumer. So what exactly is an ecological pyramid? Scientists use these ecological pyramid diagrams to represent different characteristics of an ecosystem's biological community. We'll look at 3 different types of ecological pyramids today. Now, let's talk about these 3 types of ecological pyramids. Ecological pyramids are vital in understanding the community interactions that take place in ecosystems. First, we are going to begin with what is called a pyramid of numbers. It is called the pyramid of numbers because it shows the number of organisms in each population at each trophic level on the pyramid. This is evident by the freshwater ecosystem food chain pyramid of numbers now on your screen. You will notice that there are significantly more aquatic plants, the producers at the first trophic level, than there are largemouth bass, the tertiary consumer at the fourth trophic level. You can also see this evidence by looking at an oak tree. An oak tree can serve as an ecosystem that now houses 2,000 insects. Now this oak tree, though, is very, very large. So while it doesn't necessarily make up the greatest number, we will see later that it may make up more biomass. This pyramid of numbers shows again the different trophic levels. The first being your autotrophs or producers, the second being your primary consumers, the third level are your secondary consumers, and the fourth level being the tertiary consumers. In this case, a predatory bird. Now we are going to look at what is called a biomass pyramid. This is showing the amount of living material in each system, or the amount of biomass. A biomass pyramid shows the relative masses of the producers and consumers at each trophic level. You will notice in the biomass pyramid on the right of your screen that the grass has the greatest amount of mass, which is represented by occupying the widest part of the pyramid. The next biomass pyramid represents a human as the secondary consumer. As you progress up the pyramid, you will notice the mass decreases, and the reason why plays into our final pyramid. Now, you might be starting to ask yourself, why are there less organisms at the top, which in turn leads to a lower biomass at that level? All of your answers can now be found in the third ecological pyramid, known as the energy pyramid. The energy pyramid, which you can now see a familiar example on your screen, demonstrates the amount of energy available at each trophic level within that specific feeding relationship. In an ecosystem, energy only moves in one direction, and that is upwards through a food chain or food web. And as that energy moves, only around 10% of it is graduated onto the next trophic level. The remaining 90% is used up in that organism's life to run the chemical reactions that occur in all living things, and then is expelled as heat or waste. Now, because only 10% of all energy moves up each trophic level, there's less energy available at the highest trophic levels. This is why there are less organisms at the top of the pyramid of numbers, and therefore less at the top of the biomass pyramid. This also explains why apex predators like wolves, killer whales, and the various species of big cats require such a large habitat. They each need a large amount of space to obtain all the necessary energy to survive, because they are at the top of the food chain. Moving forward, it is also important to note that energy can be represented by different units. The first one is calories, which you can currently see on your screen. More specifically, kilocalories, using the prefix from the metric system. The second unit, which you can now see on your screen, is joules, which is represented by a capital J, and is also a unit of the metric system. Lastly, a percent sign can also represent a unit of energy in an energy pyramid. It is important that you remember that energy moves in one direction in any ecosystem, and as stated in the first law of thermodynamics, that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It only transforms itself from one trophic level to the next. Therefore, as energy moves through a food chain or food web, it is always used up. It never just disappears because energy is necessary for all organisms' survival. All right, we have completed section 2 of your video notes for this unit. Be sure to ask if you have any questions. I'll see you in class.